Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion at the CSA Conference 2022, a conference focusing on economic development in Africa. Moderating this discussion, I am Julius Atuhurra, a research fellow at RISE, the multi-country research on improving systems of education program. I am based at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. The title of our discussion today is Consolidating Political Will for Improving Education Systems in 4 African Countries, Perspectives from the RISE Community. In terms of structure, we'll have 3 separate 10-minute presentations in quick succession, followed by 2 separate 10-minute discussion presentations. This will then be followed by a 30-minute Q&A session, after which we will wrap up. In a broad sense, political will is a critical ingredient when thinking about the overarching goal of overcoming the learning crisis affecting many low and middle income countries today. Beginning in Tanzania, the discussion will highlight the importance of countries' historical paths, and our first presenter will share illuminating thoughts about what has motivated education policy in Tanzania since independence. Our second presentation will then introduce us to the concept of deliberative forums, making the case of how and why different stakeholders should be included in policymaking. This presentation will showcase education policy dialogues that are currently taking place in Nigeria. The third presentation will highlight interventions by a South African NGO, Fundawande, that are geared towards improving foundational learning, highlighting Fundawande's work in 3 South African provinces. This presentation will also demonstrate consensus building with government around foundational learning. The reflections of our 2 discussants will also make connections to their work and experiences. The first discussant will bring perspectives from RISE work in Ethiopia, and the second discussant will apply a Tanzanian policymaker lens to this discussion. Some housekeeping aspects. Please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your monitor to post your question, and do not post the same question more than once. We will endeavor to answer all the questions. Panelists will receive time alerts through the chat facility at halfway stage and 2 minutes to the end. Without further ado, I will now introduce our first presenter. Ken Opalo is a researcher on the RISE Tanzania team and RISE Political Economy of Adoption team. He is an assistant professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. His research interests include legislative institutions and politics in Africa, the politics of education policy, and state building through subnational government. Ken's first book, Legislative Development in Africa, Politics and Post-Colonial Legacies, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. He has also published in the British Journal of Political Science, World Development, Governance, the Journal of Historical Political Economy, and the Journal of Legislative Studies. Ken is currently working on his next book, Educating Citizens and Workers, the Politics of Education Policy in Tanzania since 1961. Today, Ken is presenting on political historical work, looking at the politics of learning versus schooling in Tanzania since 1961. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you very much, Julius, for a generous introduction. It's great to be here today with my fellow esteemed panelists. The motivating question for this paper is what has historically motivated education policy in Tanzania? And I think that this is a core question as we think through the ongoing global learning crisis and how we can improve learning outcomes in low and middle income countries, and actually in all countries, because the learning crisis is global in high income and low income countries as well. And the motivating assumptions are as follows. First of all, the literature on education, the introduction of mass schooling, beginning in Europe and spreading through the rest of the world, right, tells us that governments fund education for reasons, for many reasons, not all of which are conducive to learning. Schooling came about as a way to craft good citizens and to strengthen the state. Schooling was also funded, has historically been funded as a deliberate effort to create a workforce. And that's both in terms of tooling the workforce with necessary skills, but also socializing the workforce to be obedient workers as opposed to just skilled workers, right? So we should have this in mind when we think about learning outcomes, because often understanding the core motivations for schooling or how the state understands schooling can give us insights as to what they consider to be the core priorities in the education sector. And so our reform efforts and evidence generation, as the RISE program is doing in multiple countries, should be sensitive to core government objectives. At the same time, this paper tries to understand how elite ideological framing can shape the political market sensitivity to education policy. So, we often assume that electoral incentives alone could drive the government into either providing education or improving learning outcomes. While the case of Tanzania shows that elite framing of the point of schooling can actually suppress demand for schooling itself. Tanzania rationed access to secondary education for 40 years and did so without significant political cost. Corollary to that is the idea that electoral politics is biased in favor of access as opposed to learning. And this is because access, elements of access are easily visible and attributable from the voter's perspective. So if you build schools, if you abolish fees, that's often very visible and attributable, and politicians can benefit from doing that. Investing in learning is a bit more complicated. Voters do not always readily attribute improvements in learning outcomes to political efforts, right? So if you train teachers or improve school management, reform the curriculum, resulting in pupils doing well in school, parents may not readily attribute that to the government. They may think that it's because their kids are smart or their own parental investment is what's driving the outcome. And so the electoral incentives are not always aligned in favor of improving learning outcomes. And again, that's something that we should be cognizant of as we think about the political economy of education sectors more broadly. All right, so the case of Tanzania. Tanzania is interesting because, as I said, Tanzania rationed access for a while, which means that it's now struggling to boost both access in the midst of also worrying about improving learning outcomes. This is just a snapshot of DHS surveys showing you male and female secondary school attainment rates across income quintiles. And it's striking that the wealthiest quintile in Tanzania, this is from figures from between 2015 and 2017, right, are doing poorly even relative to the lowest quintile in Kenya as far as secondary schooling goes. This just gives you perspective of the extent to which schooling was constricted in the Tanzanian case. And this is not just because of Tanzania's economic conditions. Kenya and even Uganda, which is a post-war case after the 1980s, were able to come up with political strategies of providing mass schooling on the cheap, while Tanzania deliberately constricted access to secondary schooling for a while. And the figures show these dynamics. So, to understand the history of education policy in Tanzania, I divided it into 4 sections, which I'll talk about in a bit. So if you think about primary schooling, in the immediate post-independence period, Tanzania actually was rationing primary schooling. The idea was to achieve universal primary education by 1989. Politics got in the way. That goal was moved forward. so that the UPE investment started in the mid-70s, and you can see this rise in total primary school enrollment. There was a period of stagnation caused by economic decline, and then the more recent expansion of primary schooling has happened over the last 20 years. Secondary schooling, on the other hand, is flat for almost the entire post-colonial period until the early 2000s, when Tanzania starts expanding secondary schooling. And that's because barely no schools were being constructed during that period. There's a deliberate policy to restrict access to secondary schooling. Primary schooling was supposed to be a terminal degree, if you will, emphasizing practical skills for agrarian socialist development under Ujamaa. And you can see the declines in transition rates from secondary to high school, from primary to high school, even as Tanzania was ramping up UPE in the 1970s. And during this period, about half of kids leaving primary school attended private secondary schools because the government was simply not building public secondary schools. That changed during this time period of the last 20 years. So what explains all of this, right? I'm thinking through this in terms of a political settlements approach. On the one hand, Tanzania, after independence, was very pragmatic about the education system. It was about modernization and manpower planning to Africanize both the state bureaucracy and the private sector. Socialism and Ujamaa came about in 1967 with the Education for Self-Reliance. This emphasized primary schooling as a terminal level of schooling for agrarian development. By the 80s, that system had not worked out so well. So there's a need to reform the education system, partly because the government was running out of money due to economic crisis. That reform period lasted from about 82 to 95. And then after 95, as the economy was liberalizing and multi-party politics resumed, the government has found it harder to ration access as it did under the period of single-party rule. And so as a consequence of this history, access is still a big concern for education policy in Tanzania. And throughout this period, if you think about learning was emphasized in the first period, learning in terms of academic achievement, but it was limited in supply. During these the intermediate two periods, learning in terms of academic achievement was de-emphasized, with emphasis being on acquisition of practical vocational skills for agrarian development. And then since 95, the government has made efforts to improve learning as we conventionally understand it, with the introduction of competency-based curriculum in 2005, and reforms to improve learning outcomes introduced in 2013. And so I'll just quickly show you, evidence of this rationing, if you will, in my last 2 minutes here. And it's striking, right, that you see increases in primary education if you look at data from Afrobarometer, while secondary schooling flatlines throughout the entire period. You also see this in DHS data. This is just looking at women education attainment. There's a bit of improvement in the 70s and flatlining through the early 2000s. If you look at learning outcomes, this is a bit more encouraging. There were actual increases in the 70s, followed by stagnation during the economic decline of the 80s to the mid 90s, and then improvements that we've seen more recently, telling us that what the government does in terms of the logics of education actually does inform learning outcomes, and that we should take those elements seriously. And then, Tanzania is also interesting because of this public-private balance in the secondary schooling. The private sector was huge for post-primary schooling for a while. The government has since taken over, as you see, with the plummeting involvement of the private sector, which again reminds us that the government now is basically the agenda setter for secondary schooling in Tanzania. And Nyerera's own sort of understanding of the goals of schooling, tells us something about what he saw the government to be doing. So as late as the early 80s, he was adamant that primary school education was what they meant by education in Tanzania, and that everything else would be rationed and limited to a core elite group of pupils who would be employed by the government. And so investment was made for a few, with the rest encouraged to acquire practical skills. Now, this may seem as an illogical approach to some, but I think from the government's perspective in the 60s and 70s, with manpower planning being such a dominant idea, this just didn't look as crazy back then. And so as we think through improvements in learning outcomes, we shouldn't ignore these structural questions that governments deal with. I will stop there, and in the Q&A, we can talk more about the differences in the electoral incentives posed by the politics of access versus the politics of quality. Suffice it to say that data from Afrobarometer again do suggest that concerns about quality are not core drivers of voters' evaluation of government performance. Access is still key. Politicians understand that, and that's what they're most likely to invest in when they're thinking about the education sector more broadly. I'll stop there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. We'll now move on to the second presentation. And I will now introduce the presenter. Leonard Wantchekon is Principal Investigator for the RISE Nigeria team. He is the James Madison Professor of Political Economy, Politics and International Affairs at the Princeton University. He is the founder and president of the African School of Economics and the Pan-African Scientific Research Council. His research centers on political economy, development economics, and economic history, with regional focus on Africa. He focuses on substantive topics in democracy and development, education and social mobility, and the long-term social impact of slavery and colonial rule. Leonard is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Econometric Society, the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development, and a research affiliate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Today, Leonard is presenting on policy deliberation and social contracts in education. Over to you, Leonard.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. This presentation will be based on an ongoing project in Nigeria that on institutional experimentation. Beside policy experimentation on the specific education policies, there is a need for an experiment with various processes of decision-making, processes of this policy design and implementation. And this is what this project is about. So as a way of introduction, so the project is on deliberation. And in political philosophy, deliberation is it's understood to be central to decision-making in a democracy. It helps conflict resolution, it boosts voter information, and make citizens more motivated. And in my own work, I find that deliberative campaign, town hall meeting in an election, improve ethical voting, policy knowledge, and rejection of corruption. Now, there is little evidence on how deliberation will affect policy design. Like decision-making processes involving stakeholders. What impact does it have? There is some work on monetary policy in the context of the US, how the federal, how the central bank make a decision on policy, inclusiveness, does it improve quality of the decision, but not much on policy. So what we try to understand in this project is to basically to see whether constructive dialogue between educational stakeholders and politicians will improve learning outcome and support for education. And the intervention has three components. First, information gathering, about policy preferences and policy priorities, and then deliberation through the organization of education summit involving the governor's office and also the whole political elite. And then drafting and signing of a social contract, which is not binding at all, but a way to summarize basically not only the information that came out during the meeting, but also some kind of collective commitment, written commitment to do something. So the research question is basically how the effect of this intervention that I just described, how this is going to affect, policy design priorities, stakeholder buy-in and investment, and what are the mechanisms? The mechanism of deliberation has always been around two key. One is information acquisition, formalized through some social contract, but also empowerment and ownership. The assumption is that when individuals contribute to a decision making, the decision becomes theirs. So as opposed to the decision of others, that's they are that they are implementing. So, and then we are also going to look at the heterogeneity around gender, about context and so on, cultural context and so on. So the timeline: first, collect data, as I mentioned. Second, the summit. Third, and it's the post-summit. The summit is basically to basically have a clear sense of what should be done, and then to agree and sign a contract. So that's very important. And the pre-summit is about structuring and informing the discussions. Now the post-summit is about engaging with government so that they can make commitment on the basis of what came out of the summit, and engaging with the communities as well, so that they can, so you have a supply side commitment, the demand side commitment, if you will, and then tracking measures to of impact, not only impact of investments by stakeholders, impact on the political process, and also impact on learning outcome, and also on on teachers and parents. Okay. So we had a bunch of surveys that was done, and I'm not going to go through the details. So, and the survey show heterogeneity between different locations, but this is a randomized experiment, not a randomized experiment of policy, but of decision-making processes. So some LGAs were, some LGAs, some local government areas were basically assigned to do this deliberative process, and the control not. So the pre-treatments basically measures are very similar along many dimensions. So, and so not only in terms of infrastructure and so on, but also in terms of students, students' performance, because we also run a test. So with the survey of the condition of the school, but also we also measure, have a test of students, and we have the data in different locations, but also across girls and boys and stuff. Okay, so this is the summit. It was really fascinating. So it was moderated by this lady, and I just introduced, and this is the representative of the government, and we had a very, very robust, kind of discussions for about a day, and then this led to this kind of contract, on quality, on financial management, on access, and it was signed by civil society organization, traditional ruler, the school-based management committee chairman, quality assurance educator, and also by the head teacher. And this contract was transmitted to, to the governor. And then following the summit, the government officials were invited to draft a work plan with specific, with very specific plan to operationalize the commitment written in the social contract. And, so we also organize, as I'm going to show in a second, a post-summit demand-side engagement with stakeholders to sort of see, okay, here is what the government is doing, and this is what, and this is so what do you want to do? Okay, and so on. Okay, so, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, okay. Here is an example of the work plan by the government. Objective 1, incentive to encourage enrollment. Activity 1, ensure the minimum 1 meal per day, blah, blah, blah. So clearly the government have written commitment in this work plan. That's public, that's very important. This is the continuation of this. And then post-summit. So we organized from earlier this year, follow-up workshop with stakeholders from each of the school, monitored in the treated and in the treated areas. And it was a full 6 days to present, first of all, the finding of the education summit so that people have a clear sense of the priorities, but also inform the participant of what came out of the meeting, and then the work plan of the government, to reiterate the importance of, and then we also take the opportunity to reiterate the commitment from the different stakeholders. Say, okay, this is what we want to do. This is what the governments have committed to do in the work plan. What do you want to do? Okay, so the pre-summit, the post-summit community engagement. Those are pictures from Enugu and Oyo states, and so just to give you some example. So in one of the communities in Enugu, where we have a high student-teacher ratio, stakeholders volunteer to search for retired teachers to achieve the standard minimum teacher-student ratio. Because in Suka, insufficient learning material and classroom infrastructure, the PTA have committed to meet, to assess, to raise funds, to fix that, And in other places, it's about, teacher training. And in Oyo, so people learn, knowing what the work plan is and what the government is committed to do, they actually are very explicit about their part in this kind of bargain. So the next stage of this process is to collect the data on how this commitment has been implemented and how this affects teachers' absenteeism, learning outcome, and the engagement of school-based management committees and this kind of stuff. Okay, so as you can see, there are two mechanisms at play here. One is information. The meeting get all of us to have a clear sense of the policy priorities. In some places is infrastructure, in other places is teacher training, in some other places is financial management. More. So whatever the work plan of the government, the state governor is, it tied to the policy priorities as expressed by the members. And then you can also see efforts and commitment to invest from different stakeholders, and which is going to not only encourage the government to do its part, but also get teachers and the students to do their part as well. So going forward, as I said earlier, so we have to track the implementation of the contract, track school improvement and change in learning, and so on. So we beside the writing papers about this, and then show in a very technical way the impact. We will have some sort of qualitative report on this, so that this can serve as a model. Maybe part will be rejected, part will be accepted in other contexts, so that this can be the beginning of a movement, I should say, towards more inclusive policymaking process for a more inclusive education outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leonard, for this exciting presentation. I will now move to our third presenter. Nangamso Mtsatse is the CEO of Fundawande, a not-for-profit organization that aims to equip teachers to teach reading for meaning and calculating with confidence in South Africa. She's in the final stages of her PhD in education policy at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and is an affiliated researcher at the Research on Socio-Economic Policy group. Nangamso has published her research in several accredited journals, and in January 2019, she was selected by the International Literacy Association as one of the top 30 under 30 researchers around the world. Nangamso has contributed to several important initiatives in the South African literacy sphere. Today, she's sharing perspectives from her work at Fundawande, including consensus building around foundational learning in South Africa. Over to you, Nangamso.
Thanks a lot, Julius, for that introduction. Thanks everyone for joining the session, and also to my fellow panelists and discussants. Today, I'll be sharing with you some of the work that we're doing in South Africa, and probably linking to the sort of the title, the theme of this panel is Fundawande, like Julius has mentioned, is an NGO based in South Africa. We have this very big, audacious vision or goal to get all kids in South Africa to be reading for meaning and calculating with confidence by the age of 10 by 2030. So every time when I say that, I often want to fall off my chair, because I realize that's probably, it's less than 10 years from to date. But in any case, the existence of Fundawande really is to try and test or experiment with models that, one, improve learning outcomes in the foundation phase, and probably two, scalable within the current system, in the South African system. So we often talk about how some, education, or at least in our context, that, we're trying to solve a political problem with a technical solution. So what we try to do in Fundawande is kind of merge those two in order to see sort of learning gains. Very quickly, overall, we are running 3 RCTs in 3 provinces or states in South Africa. The first one is the Eastern Cape, an RCT of 60 schools, where we focus particularly on coaching, structured pedagogy. The second one is in Limpopo, an RCT of 120 schools, and I'll quickly share with you sort of what does that look like. But they're really trying to address one of the 2 biggest crises that we have in our country, which is unemployment and very poor learning outcomes. So how do you effectively use unemployed youth with a matric or a grade 12 to be able to support teachers in improving learning outcomes. And then the third one, Western Cape one, is probably the one that is most closest to what we're trying to unpack or understand as Fundawande is, what does a province-wide scale program look like? And how best do we prepare government officials, departments in scale? And particularly that we know that there's a lot of research that has shown us that there's sort of a decrease in learning incomes, learning outcomes, the moment you hand over an intervention to government. So just quickly on the Eastern Cape one, like I mentioned, it's an RCT of 60 schools.
Moment, Nangam, so could you switch to presentation style?
Okay, thank you. I didn't even realize that. Thanks, Julius.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. That the RCT of 60 schools, like I mentioned, it's a package of structured pedagogy, materials and resources, and capacitation of heads of departments, as well as government officials, in order to provide ongoing support for the teachers in the schools. This is just sort of 1 year, after 1 year of implementation. This is just really a snapshot of the independent evaluation that we did. Very overall is that the composite score of the reading component was 0.17 standard deviation. if you compare that to the control schools, I mean, roughly about 26% of a full school year, where the control schools, where the treatment schools outperform the control schools. Unfortunately, I mean, COVID hit, and the Eastern Cape intervention started in 2019, 2020, as we know, but we used this as a very great opportunity to be able to collect some data or some insights on really the impact of COVID in the education sector, which has probably changed the dialogue tremendously in our context, but really to see, look, we've suffered severe learning losses. And I mean, this report that came out of the evaluation has also led a lot of other government sort of initiatives to respond to learning outcomes, because I mean, up until this report came out, we knew that COVID impacted education, but there was not any sort of measurement of what that actually looked like. The Western Cape one, like I mentioned, very exciting. And this is just really, in yellow there, we see that Funda Wande started last year with 50 schools and with a lot of political buy-in, will, discussions, and trying to embed the program within the system. The government has committed an additional 50 schools. So currently this year, we're having a 100 schools pilot, and the plan for the for government is then to incrementally roll out the intervention to targeting the low-performing schools in the province, and for them sort of a 5-year plan, and to aim that they would reach all of the lower-performing schools by 2025. I mean, that's roughly about 54,000 learners in the system. And then to the Limpopo one, I mean, like I mentioned earlier on, there's 2 significant problems or issues or crises in South Africa, and even exacerbated tremendously by COVID. And really the Limpopo intervention is to say, you know, how do we best use these 2 crises in order to, one, you know, decrease unemployment, and of course, and to improve learning outcomes in the system. So that 120 school RCT includes includes 3 arms, 40 schools with just a TA and a structured pedagogy. So TA, teacher's assistant, in most cases, in fact, in all cases, our requirements was post-matric, but we were quite surprised that during recruitment and selection process, we almost attracted about 60% of people that had a post-matric qualification. And that's how steep the unemployment rate in South Africa is. Although we were like benching low, you know, there was quite an overwhelming response there from people with a post-matric qualification. And then the second arm is what we call materials only. So just following the structured pedagogy or the materials package, where we train teachers, we train the subject advisors. And really with this one is to experiment with the sort of, if a government with bare fiscal or budget or their current existing structure of the education system, where teachers only get I think it's two-day training over sort of a 3-month cycle. You know, how much, if we were to try and embed our program to really existing processes and systems in a government system, to be able to see if we can shift any learning outcomes. And really just to say here is I mean, and I'll share shortly the preliminary or the first midline report on there is the TA or Teachers Assistant Program really focuses on 4 pillars. Is that rigorous selection process, training in the foundation, literacy and numeracy skills. We acknowledge that these are not teachers, they're not trained as teachers. They cannot be, we cannot assume that they will take up responsibilities of teachers. And it's important that not only that they train, but they're coupled with training of what to do when they get into the classroom. And of course, most importantly is sufficient ongoing support. Why this is important is because currently, and I'll share now shortly, currently there's a similar sort of government-led sort of intervention that has been influenced by this sort of work that we're currently doing. Some early results there, if you look at you know, this is the maths effect size, almost, you know, 0.38 standard deviation effect size there. And that's an additional 95% of a year of learning. And that's the mathematics assessment. If you look at the, specifically the reading there of 0.44 standard deviation, which we must say we were quite, we didn't expect this. We dived into a realm of area in terms of context, province, that is quite challenging, and an area where it doesn't really necessarily receive a lot of attention in terms of interventions. But I mean, obviously, this is very encouraging for us to know that after 1 year of implementation, we're able to see these types of results. And then just to quickly highlight on the government sort of influence element of the TA intervention, that I mean, that those findings really sort of drove a concentrate and probably a focus at discussions and deliberation with politicians and government officials as they are rolling out. I mean, our president announced this massive employment initiative where they're spending billions to try and get youth people employed, but working with government, both from the presidency and as well as in the education sector, to say, look, if you know, this is money that within the Ministry of Education, it doesn't come out of their budget. It comes from a special presidential government. And how do you best use this, considering with all the constraints in the system, to be able to improve learning outcomes? Ready to say that we've been quite become thought leaders in trying to help government to effectively implement these or sort of this specific implementation. So this is just really an illustration that last year, when the 2 years ago, actually, when the president made the call, almost 4.5 billion was spent, no training, nothing. They just employed, and even till this day, unclear how the selection or recruitment process happened, and they were deployed in schools and they needed to flourish. Last year, again, there was a repetition of this, spending 4 billion. And I mean, from last year, and with a lot of the findings and results from our intervention, you know, we are now getting into the realm of influencing government, because most actually on Sunday, our president then again announced an extension of this project. And we're quite excited because it provides us with an opportunity to share our learnings with government. And at least, you know, if there's going to be so much funds that are going to be spent, that it's spent in a way that it will benefit the system. So really, in a nutshell, what we're all about at Funda Wande, we're an NGO. We don't see ourselves as people to take things to scale. We don't want to scale. We don't have the capacity to scale, but really to try and influence government on how they spend their money. And this is just a rough sort of illustration of in education currently to date in South Africa, how many initiatives that sort of focus on unemployed youth. That's in total about $40 million, $2.6 million versus what government is spending on these types of initiatives. And there's no way that we'll be living under a rock to think that we can change system-wide learning improvements with a sort of a split like this in the expenditure and initiatives and efforts. I think I'll end there, Julius. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nangamso. Really exciting, the audacious goal, the positive influence on government, really nice things to hear. Okay, so we've had all our three main presentations. We'll now move into the discussion section of this presentation. So we have two main presenters leading the discussion. And I'll begin with introducing the first one. So Tassew Woldehanna is the principal investigator and research team lead for the RISE Ethiopia team. He's a professor of economics and the president of Addis Ababa University. He obtained his PhD in household economics from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And he's a development economist, mainly interested in physical incidents, child welfare and poverty, employment, micro and small scale enterprise development, entrepreneurship, and food security. He has published several book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals in the area of poverty, fiscal management, education, health, child and adolescent development, and small-scale enterprise development. He has achieved several research awards and is the principal investigator for Young Lives in Ethiopia, Early Learning Partnership, ELP, and Girls and Adolescents Global Evidence, GAGE. Tassew is our first discussant today. Over to you, Tassew.
Okay, thank you. I'm providing my reflection based on some of the RISE Ethiopia work. As you all know, the Ethiopian government is highly dedicated to improve both access and learning in Ethiopia. And improving learning outcomes are central to the education reform in the Ethiopian case. And Ethiopia introduced a general education quality improvement program, what they call GEQUIP-E in 2008, with the aim of improving teaching and learning condition, which was implemented in 3 phases, where 2 of the phases have completed and now is in the 3rd phase. And they spend in each phase over 400 million in each phase. And RISE Ethiopia research is designed to assess the impact of this GEQUIP, the last phase, and looking at from a system perspective. It's not an RCT-based evaluation, but it is a systematic approach. And to see political willingness to improve the education system, government has spent more than a quarter of the public expenditure they allocated to education sector. And some regional government even spend up to 35% of their public expenditure. We see over the past 20-25 years, enrollment has expanded and reached the level of universal access to primary education. However, quality education was declining at some point and even stagnated. If you see the trend in net primary enrollment in Ethiopia for grade 1 to 8, already reached 100% into 2018, but slightly declining after that, maybe because of the current crisis and political turmoils. And there is a remarkable improvement in access, but that was not without cost. There has been evidence of learning crisis in Ethiopia. Let me go to some of the results. One of the results that demonstrates this is Young Life study conducted in 2013, 2016, for those 12 years old in different time, in 8 years difference, we see percent of children who can read anything, who can't read anything increase from 10% to 14%. Percent of children who can read letters declined. Percent of children who can read a word decline, also who can read passage sentence slightly increased. When we see from the mathematical competency over these 2 years, the average score of mathematical competency declined by 34%, and disaggregated by several examples. And when we see the trends in grade 4 national learning assessment done by the Ethiopian National Examination Center, which is under the Ministry of Education, conducted for grade 4 for reading and mathematics and composite average of total subjects. So was declining until 2012, starts increasing, but now declining, which is still below the level in year 2000 for both reading and mathematics. And even for grade 8 national assessment, it shows the same result, that is stagnating. There's no improvement in quality, while access has increased for both English and mathematics. And when we see also for the early grade reading and for early grade mathematics assessment conducted in 2014, 2016, 2018 by USAID using the early grade reading assessment and early grade mathematics assessment tools, that shows there is no any improvement in trend. This is a fundamental age where reading and mathematics competency is starting, and there is no signs of improvement in learning outcome. So why is what is the reason for improved access but declining learning? So we have assessed this from a system point of view. We know that education works in a system where there are politicians and several actors from the ministry to the regional level, to the district level, and to the school, and also to parents and other stakeholders. They all have to act coherently if the education system have to improve and show signs of good learning. When we see the Ethiopian education system, it is coherent around access to primary education and schooling, but not coherent for quality. We know huge resource is spent, and there is education information system largely provide data of enrollment, but not about how much schools have achieved in learning. The schools are highly pressurized to increase enrollment, decrease educational wastage, dropout, repetitions, but success is measured always by access record, not by learning. So there is incoherence between the delegation and finance, inadequate resources to implement the mission delegated, although this more than 526 million has been allocated for a general quality improvement program, still is not used to provide incentive for teachers. Salary of teacher is very low. The education information system provides only enrollment figures and is also not supported by technology, is still based on the paper. Questionnaire is not providing enough information for how learning has progressed over time. And there is also delegation to information that is incoherence. There partial emphasis on inputs and process rather than on outcomes. IMIS do not provide information on quality of education. It's only providing access and wastages. And there is also incoherence regarding to the motivation. Achieving or failing to achieve objective delegates was loosely associated with reward and punishment. Poor and good performance or learning were not adequately captured. And as a result, accountability relationship on quality improvement was poorly defined and implemented. And first, there is a first generation learner perspective that the access has increased. So school system does not take into consideration that many of the children joining the schools are from the first generation learner, where their parents are illiterate and they don't have support from households. So this kind of children requires special support at school so that they can have better learning. So in general, there is a strong political will to improve access and quality, but the education system is largely coherent around creating access to primary education, but not for learning. On the ground of accountability is associated with finance, but not with learning. Rapid increase in access results disadvantaged children joining the school with little support from parents, which we call is the first generation learner. You can see Rice paper published in Journal of Education there, this argument with evidence from Young Life data. The support students obtain from school does not consider that kids come from the poorer families. So when we see the three presenters, they have the Nigerians presentation have about why learning access is only measured to access, but I have one questionnaire note for the Tanzanian presenter Ken, that in Tanzania, the electoral politics is biased in favor of access, and learning is not a political variable. Usually, it is the public who should value quality. And if they have a quality education, their children can get better employment and better place. So why are the public taking into consideration the government performance in quality into the election? It should be the public who take quality into consideration. So if Ken can give us this explanation on that. And from Nigeria also, that there are deliberate campaign improves ethical voting, and there is this RCT type, and we have seen that engagement and social contract is very important. This is an RCT. Can this be scaled up to a large scale in Nigeria, let alone to all other African countries? Can you give us cases when this can be taken to a wider level? And the South African presenter is also excellent, that it has some learning for the Ethiopian case. Usually when kids or teachers are supported by additional supports, then kids will have better learning outcome. And this could be very important for Ethiopia, as the Ethiopian kids are usually from the first generation learner, where they need more support from schools that school teachers cannot support because the salary is very low and the school size is very high. But if they have an additional assistant to the teacher, then I think children can perform in early grade. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tassew. Thank you. And to our panelists, obviously the previous presenters, some of these questions will be engaged with when we open up the discussion. We'll start with those. So I'll now introduce our last discussant, the final one. Aneth Komba is a researcher on the RISE Tanzania team. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Dar es Salaam, and she's the Director General of the Tanzania Institute of Education, an institute responsible for curriculum development, textbooks development, in-service teacher training, and research services in Tanzania. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Education with honors and a Master of Arts in Education from the University of Dar es Salaam, and a PhD from the University of Bath, where she specialized in educational leadership, management, and policy studies. She lectures in educational management and school administration, policy planning and administration, human resource management in educational organizations, and qualitative research methodology. So Aneth is our final discussant, and over to you, Aneth.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks a lot, presenters, for such a good presentation. I'll provide my reflection on the basis of the 3 presentations, and I'll start with a presentation by Opalo. I mean, reading through the paper, I noted that the paper used a variety of sources of data collection, including literature review, to respond to a question which read, what has been the point of schooling in Tanzania since independence? And I noted that the author traces the design of education system in Tanzania to determine how these have contributed to the current learning crisis. And basically, the major conclusion from this paper is the politicians are in favor of increasing access to schooling at the expense of quality, meaning that they are not interested with what is going on in the classroom. So from this paper, I think we as researchers, we need to think and ask ourselves at least one question. And this question is, why politicians in less developing countries focus on efforts related to increasing access rather than quality? I think we need ourselves to ask this question and think of the reasons. I mean, reading through the paper, I noted that Opalo
just a moment, Aneth, just a moment. Are you able to switch on your video?
I think, yes. Yeah.
Please, thank you so much.
So, I'm saying that while reading through this paper, I noted that a number of reasons have been given to this question. And one of the reasons, including the fact that schooling is more readily visible and attributed than learning. But I think the author also presented a number of efforts which was done by the government of Tanzania in 1970s to address the growing demand of qualified teachers. So to me, I think at that particular time, and given the economic condition of the country, these efforts could be considered among the government initiatives in improving teaching and learning processes. So I think it is maybe unfair to think that maybe politicians was completely not considering the importance of quality education, but there was some efforts depending on the then existing economic condition. But also, I've noted that the author discussed issues regarding structural challenges within the Tanzania education system, which reflect the declining tendency of the number of students as you go up the ladder. But one thing is lacking in the discussion, and this is an indication of number of students who join the skill-related courses at the end of primary or secondary education. And I think at this point, I would really wish to emphasize that it is important for all countries or most of the countries in developing world to consider and strengthening not only academic, but also TVET system. To me, I believe that TVET system is crucial in producing the middle cadre, like technicians and the artisans, who they don't need university education, but rather they just need diploma and certificates to be able to employ themselves. There's this tendency whereby most countries have been focusing on expanding secondary education and university education. And some of the countries are currently struggling at reducing the number of graduates, because I mean, there's been a high rate of unemployment. And so I think rather than focusing on the number of students who are joining secondary and university education, we also need to consider a number of those who are joining post-secondary education for the purpose of gaining skills for self-employment or being employed in various sectors. And the other point I wish to make from Opala's paper is the fact that in the past, it is true that politicians were interested in investing, we're not interested in investing to aspects which are related to quality improvement. But if you trace the current direction, you will note that starting from 2015 to 2020, the ruling party manifesto and even the opposition party's manifesto mentioned a number of commitments which are aimed at improving what goes on in the classroom. For example, if you read the CCM, the 2020 CCM manifesto, it explains its intention to strengthen the teaching and learning process in the classroom by training the pre-primary and early grade teachers from class 1 to class 4. So I think at least currently there's a changing direction where now politicians are starting to think of what really is going on in the classroom. And I think if the same study that was conducted by Opala, if it will be repeated and it will use data from 2015 to 20, we are going to see some improvement in terms of the politician perspective of the quality of education. So going to another paper by Leonard, I think this paper presented the findings of an intervention that is aimed at understanding how constructive dialogue between education stakeholders and politicians influence education investment. And basically, I am concluding that the study emphasized on the importance of collaborative and participatory decision-making. And it shows that effective engagement helps both politicians and community members to agree on common problems or issues and its respective solution. But all of us as researchers, I think we are aware of several advantages and disadvantages of engaging the public in policy-making processes. And one of the advantages, if you read the literature, is that engaging the public in policy-making, it encouraged the public to have meaningful inputs into the policy-making processes and ensure the sustainability and ownership of the policies. So, but while there are numerous advantages associated with public participation, there are also advantages. And I would really wish to hear from Nigerian experience, if he can share with us some of the disadvantages or challenges which were associated with using this approach in making policies in Nigeria. And I also think that to be able to use this approach for making policy in country, there are necessary conditions which are need to be considered. And one of these factors is time. Sufficient time is needed because, like what he explained, it involves collection of information, deliberation of information, and drawing and signing of the social contract. So I would really wish to learn from Nigerian case how much time is required to formulate such kind of policies. And to me, sometimes I do explain to my students that the issue of time, because of the issue of times, maybe involving the public in making, in designing policy is not an effective mechanism of solving problems which need immediate solutions. And lastly, I think there's a need to consider the issue of community knowledge, interest, and understanding on the importance of education to their children's life. When community members are ignorant or when they devalue the value of education, it is difficult for them to participate on effective discussion and even in supporting on the implementation of the policy. So at this point, I would really wish to learn from Nigerian case as to whether the issue of knowledge regarding the value of education to the parent and community members was a challenge to this design of making policy. I mean, going to the last paper by Nangamso, I think the paper presents an intervention that were aimed at improving pupil literacy and numeracy skills in Limpopo district. And the paper discusses a number of learners and teacher support materials that were used to teach literacy and numeracy during the foundation phase. And some of the findings show that the trained and supported teachers assistant in grade 1 were effective in improving foundational reading and writing skills. And the study clearly show the importance of teacher training in improving learning outcome. However, I have noted that there is one weakness. The training was provided for only a few days. It was like maybe 4 days. So I also wish to note here that this is the general tendency. In most developing countries, there's this tendency of providing very short in-service training to teachers. And in a way, it really affects the student outcome. I think there's a need for countries and governments to rethink and invest more in the provision of continuous teacher professional development, and to make sure that this the in-service training is provided regularly and for a sufficient time is allocated to enable the teachers to gain skills which are really useful in improving student learning outcome. With that paper, Nanganga, I have 2 questions. I'm trying to link of what is happening in Limpopo with what is happening in Tanzania, and I really wish to learn on 2 things. How did the teachers in Limpopo spend their school time, or rather, how did they use the materials prepared by by your intervention, and for how long they use the materials which are regular materials? Or, for example, in our schools, we have a main textbook, and also there are supplementary textbooks which are provided by non-governmental organizations. So I've noted that our teachers are getting a lot of problem in terms of balancing. I mean, when to use the materials which are provided by non-government actors, and when to use materials which are provided by the government actors. So I really wish to learn experience from Limpopo on how the teachers balance their time and make sure that they use both the materials which were provided by your intervention, your government, your non-government organization, and those which were prepared by the government. And lastly, I've noted that the paper show the importance of collaboration between government and private actors in improving learning outcomes. It is obvious that the government on its own can never achieve improvement of learning outcomes. There is really a need of collaborating with non-government actors. But yet, there's no indication of sustainability strategies. And this is a common tendency, even in Tanzania. We have a lot of non-government actors who come, they help the government, and once they leave, then everything ends where they started. So I would really wish to know whether the study in South Africa will be scaled up, and what are the sustainability strategies, so that to make sure that the larger part of South Africa can benefit from this intervention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Aneth, and thank you all our panelists. We've had a very nice conversation. We've overshot our time. We really didn't do well on time, so we are going to have to recover some of this time in the remaining 22 minutes. So we will now move into the main discussion, and we are going to address both the questions that have come from the discussants and also the questions that are coming from our attendees of this panel discussion. So I will request that the panelists, and going by the order of presentation, to first of all respond very briefly, touching on all the items, if possible, that were raised by the discussants. And please, this is not an opportunity to make another long presentation. Let's just touch on them and give some insight so that we allow enough time for the questions coming from the attendees. Thank you. So Ken.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aneth, for the close read and the excellent comments. And yes, I fully agree with you that we've seen quite a bit of movement, beginning with the CBC policy on improving education outcomes in Tanzania. And I think your question is a reminder that I should frame the paper better, because the point I'm trying to make in the paper is that we often imagine that there has been access and now the problem is quality and we should deal with quality. But the evidence seems to suggest that when governments face the tough choice of what do you do when you need to both increase access and improve quality, often quality gets neglected because demand for access overwhelms everything else, and politicians, because of their resource constraint, are not able to restrict access in an effort to maintain quality of learning outcomes. And so I think the gist of the paper is, one, we shouldn't ignore the history, because it's the history that has generated the lack of access that's now being met in conjunction with concerns about learning outcomes. And that, when politicians have to make a choice between the two, more often than not, they go with access, investing in access, than investing in quality for political reasons. And then on the questions from Tassew, I think why the public is not interested or in investing or in demanding quality, I think my simple answer there would be that the salience of education in any election, first of all, is never guaranteed, right? Elections are fought on multiple dimensions. More often than not, education is not one of the top items, and even if it's the top item, it might be swamped by other economic, regionalist, and whatnot considerations. And so education in itself may not always be the top priority that actually switches votes. And second, even when education is important, right, I don't think, I think we need to fully appreciate the fact that access is still a big problem in many countries, right? And even countries that have enrollment rates close to 100%, the quality of the physical infrastructure in schools is still a big problem. So if you read manifestos, right, politicians talk about, desks, uniforms, right, school feeding, right? Those are that's the currency that they use when they're talking about education policy. They're talking about learning, from what I've seen, looking at just the discourse from the political perspective, it doesn't get to the top. And so, again, in going back to my response to Dr. Komba's comments, right? I think that the question of access and the attributable elements of access are still core to how we should think about, the politics of education policy in many low-income countries. In part because many countries, right, they did UPE in the early 2000s. They're now investing in secondary schooling. Yes, there are TVET, these technical and vocational education institutions, but even Tanzania right now has less than 150,000 or so slots for TVETs, which is not nearly enough to absorb the graduates coming out of primary and secondary schools. So access will continue to be a challenge, in steps. Secondaries is now the big challenge. I'm sure university and other tertiary access questions will also become a challenge in the near future. Then, if I can take one quick minute and respond to one of the questions in the Q&A, what's the empirical evidence that there's no electoral returns to schooling? I don't think I would put it that strongly. I think the evidence that we have from Afrobarometer in particular across multiple African countries is that concerns about quality are not determinative in predicting voting intentions in elections. And we can infer from the sort of calculus of voters that, they may care about quality, but access is still a dominant concern for voters in this context. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, so we'll move on to Leonard.
Okay, so thank you very much for the comments. Really 3 points. First, about the disadvantage of the process. it's very involved because it has several stages. The pre-summit, the summit, post-summit with different components. So to be able to scale this up, it's important to streamline, the process. And because of COVID, this time the whole process, especially from the summit to the post-summit, the last events, which involve community stakeholders, it takes a whole year, but it could be shrunk to maybe 3-4 months, because there is no need, for instance, after the summit, after the work plan from the government, to wait before getting back to the schools and talk to teachers and parents and so on. So it could be done in 4 months. So streamline, shorten, that should be how we can make sure that this could be scaled up. In the chat, there was a very interesting question about why don't we broaden the concept of learning and reading even, given that we have an institution that we are proposing an institution that get the community as a whole involved in the decision. So in fact, we could also democratize and expand the curriculum. For instance, at some of the meetings, traditional leaders and chiefs were there. And one of the demands is teaching local history, teaching local culture. That will make some parents, some community members directly involved in producing materials for the kids. And I think we are currently, African School of Economics is doing currently a project in Benin on culturally sensitive curriculum, where that's, or culturally relevant curriculum that touches on that. So I think it's a very good question. So obviously, there was a question about urgency, and yes, for instance, you can have again streamlined, short, effective institutions for issues that need immediate attention. So, but the key point is find a way to listen, find a way to engage, and to demand involvement, engagement from the community as a whole, because the school outcome is driven by supply by government, by demand. In a sense, everyone has to invest for, parents and teachers, so that the outcome can be improved. There was one last question, I think about,
the one from Tassew on
anyway.
scaling up.
I'm sorry?
The one on scaling up from Tassew.
Yeah, exactly. So scaling up, as I said earlier, there is a plan to scale up. So we are engaging with federal governments, but again, to get there, streamline the process. We learned quite a bit. There might be some part that will be cut, some policy that could make shorter. There might be a way to combine virtual versus in-person, so that we can make it effective, quick, and more scalable. So yeah, there was a question about culture. So this is very important to know that this is a culturally relevant kind of institutions. There was I think Kwame Weradu, the political scientist, showed that deliberation is at the core of decision-making in African communities. And the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in architecture was won yesterday or 2 days ago by an architect from Burkina Faso. His work creates buildings that look like Abra Palabra, which is like the big kind of tents, tree under which everybody, discuss, debate, and so on. So all across West Africa, and from what I heard also in East and Southern Africa, deliberation is a culture. So it should be institutionalized, not only at government level, but also at even in policy design and policy implementation. Anyway, so thanks.
Thank you, Leonard. Okay, so we'll move on to Nangamso on the issue of how long teachers were trained or coached.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Aneth, and as well as Tassew for the comment. I mean, I've got one comment to Tassew that very interestingly enough in South Africa, teachers' salaries are the teachers are the highest paid civil servants. And their salary increases is way almost double the inflation prices. So it's very interesting to see that at least in our context, the salary incentive versus like quality of learning doesn't seem to be aligned. So just a comment on that. And on the training, with Aneth, I think the main purpose, you're correct, on the sort of in-service training and probably looking at a lot more in-depth longitudinal opportunities to engage with teachers. But the specific question in Limpopo was to say, let's look at the system. What does the system currently offer? And trainings in our context are our unions, our teacher unions are probably the second powerful unions politically in South Africa. So there's often a lot of tension with, when you take teachers out, can you take them out after school, during weekends, or whatever the case is? And we haven't cracked that code yet, but here we were really trying to work with what the current system is giving, or the inputs of the education system, which was, like I said, I think two training days every three terms. So in a year, according to the prescribed by department, teachers get up to about 8 days of training in a year cycle. So to try and see if we were to implement something as business as usual, according to government inputs, how much do you shift learning? But I completely agree. I just also want to note that we also run parallel courses that have now been institutionalized by actual higher education universities across South Africa, and we're in the process of scaling that and hoping in that way that if you don't go in the system route, that there are other avenues where teachers can access quality in service training. And then on the how did teachers use the time and the structured pedagogy, very good question. I think in our very early days, we had an assumption that teachers will like sort of put everything aside, all the stuff that are in the classroom, and implement our materials 100%. Guess what? Like you said, there are curriculum accountabilities, the teachers, checklists and whatever the case is. But in this revised version of Limpopo, what we did is we integrated the resources that teachers or classrooms receive or prescribed by the department. We integrated that within our resources. In many instances, we refer to, take out your government DBE workbook. In that way, I think in a sense of compliance, because we know a lot of these things, curriculum coverage is compliance, and also incorporating some elements of change practice pedagogy. So in a sense that we saw a lot more take up from teachers when we merged the two versus when we assumed that teachers can put aside the department's prescribed resources. So I hope that answers your question, that we're seeing a lot more fidelity in merging what is prescribed by government. And I think it's a huge problem. I think probably in most African countries, NGOs are fighting to get into classrooms. This is overwhelming teachers. Today I'm doing Funda Wande, tomorrow I'm doing USAID, tomorrow, and probably a lot more coordinated efforts, I think, in our view at least, because I think we probably, every time when we come and, change things, it probably takes teachers 2 steps backwards, like you mentioned towards the end of your comment there. Thanks a lot, Julius. That's all for me.
Thank you. There is a question from Michael Kevane. Oh, I think someone is answering this. No open question right now. Okay, so let me, I didn't know that I would get an opportunity to actually pose a question, and as Joe helps to pin some of those others. But to you, Nangamso, you talk about the influence that Funda Wande has had on the government in South Africa, but then you also hint about how when they took it on, then it seems like the details were ignored. What comments do you have about that? Because this is bound to happen.
Sure. And I think realizing that improving learning outcomes is probably a long-term thing. It's a sprint, not a marathon. And I think navigating the political landscape is one that we realized very quickly. As I mentioned earlier on, we're an organization that tries to experiment with models that can scale up. So I think being from get-go, this is the lesson now, after being, implementing at least in Eastern Cape 4 years, 2 years now in the other provinces, is government buy-in, engagements, discussions from onset. I think probably is one lesson out of that situation that we took out, at least, So it was a learning that we got the first year, and then I think we've done and we've paid a lot of efforts, resources, time organizationally. We've amplified the amount of time that we engage with government in these matters. And I think it's very encouraging to know that in most cases, the political will is there. But what we have observed is that, at least in our structure, is that it's the implementation plan or thereof. How do you implement? How do you monitor? Sort of ongoingly. So being quite targeted of where the gaps are in the system to be able for sustainable solutions or models.
Okay, thanks. So I'll actually ask the question I'd wanted to read from Michael. Many education programs seem to emphasize reading in school without a corresponding commitment to a thriving literacy ecosystem. That is to say, children's young adult and adult book publishing, authors and illustrator prizes, low-priced fiction, accessible community libraries, quality librarians. Do you see indicators of significant change in this area of policy?
So I try to address that.
Yeah,
I haven't seen it yet, but I think we should. Because, as I said earlier, what's happening in the classroom is important, but then we can also use this increased involvement of the community at large in education to create new avenues for learning, which is not just unidirectional, which is multi-directional. Like, for instance, kids to parents or young adults to who are even not in the education system, taking advantage of the existence of the school to learn, and I think one important channel is integrating the curriculum, local history, and also local culture in a different ways, but also a lot of activities. It involves some investment, like it means producing new materials and stuff to make this possible. So I think it's a fantastic point. If you create an institution that's inclusive, you can also create a curriculum that's more inclusive, that broader, that expanded, and that can only increase not only knowledge, but also motivation of the children to learn more, because they are learning things that are tied to the community where they come from.
Thank you. I would like to hear what Aneth thinks about this question. Creating an ecosystem, a thriving literacy ecosystem, beyond just teaching reading in school.
Can you please come up again with the question, please?
Yeah, so beyond emphasizing teaching reading in school, how about the ecosystem that allows the thriving of this competence? Like the examples that this question brings out is issues to do with creating, for example, accessible community libraries or quality librarians, or issuing out prizes for those kinds of.
I think we are correct. A lot of non-governmental organization efforts focus in improving literacy and numerals, and less on other efforts like what you mentioned. I think it is time now the non-governmental actors shift their direction and think of other things to support the government. There's real a need to establish like library, but in most cases, even in Tanzania, this is the case. I mean, we have like more than 50 non-government organizations, and most of them are entirely focusing in supporting the teaching of 3 R's and not on other efforts. But what we have been doing is we are trying to coordinate their efforts. So once they come with their project, they have to report to the government, they report to the ministry, and the ministry share with them what is the need of the government. So in this way, we've been able to diversify their efforts and to make sure that they are also catching and supporting the government on other efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see that Ken has his hand up, but we are really short of time. I'm very sorry about that. I would like to thank you all, our panelists and all our listeners and viewers who have attended this panel discussion for such a rich discussion. And please carry on these aspects and insights that we have gained. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is the end of this discussion.